Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. I'm sorry, but there are times when a tragedy needs to be politicized. Things can go wrong anytime. Disaster can strike anywhere. But the whole point of politics and government is to create the conditions that try and shield people from the very worst, take care of impacted communities afterward as quickly and efficiently as possible. We can do a good job or a bad job dealing with severe weather. We can plan for it or not. We can deny it or not. We can put resources towards those plans or take resources away from them. In the end, those are all political decisions. So when a tragedy does strike, we have to ask hard questions about the decisions leading up to and during that moment. The devastating flash flooding in central Texas last week is a clear-cut example of that. This was a horrible, horrible disaster, the deadliest flooding the state has seen in a century. At least 119 people have died across 6 counties since the flooding started Friday morning. At least 173 people are still missing. Haunting images have emerged of the devastation at Camp Mystic, a summer camp for girls in the banks of the Guadalupe River. At least 27 children and counselors died after they were swept up in the rapidly rising water. Today at a press conference, local first responders painted a horrifying scene of what it was like trying to rescue residents as the flooding intensified.
Door to door, waking people up, convincing them that yes, the floodwaters are coming and you need to leave now. They rescued people out of vehicles. They rescued people out of homes that were already flooding, pulling them out of windows. They entered water. There's a trailer park that flooded in minutes. One officer was there by himself and he realized, I need help. He sounded his siren, driving up and down those streets that were beginning to flood, calling on his PA system for folks to wake up and evacuate. And then 2 other officers joined him through first thigh deep, then waist deep, then chest deep water as they went from RVs and trailers and rescued people, carrying them to safety through the water.
Civil servants and police officers and volunteers put their bodies in the line trying to get as many people as possible out of harm's way. They did incredible, incredible work. They did all they could. But could failures by their state and federal government have been what made that rushed rescue operation a necessity? Were lives unnecessarily lost because of incompetence or policy decisions or dysfunction? It is not partisan politics to ask those simple questions. The Trump administration and its allies disagree.
Is there anything more that can be done congressionally, legislatively to help these folks?
In a moment like this, we feel just as helpless as everyone else. All we know to do at this moment is pray.
Let me tell you, these left-wing liberals that want to make this political and blame this storm on Donald Trump, for crying out loud, this is an act of God like we've never seen before.
Every football team makes mistakes. The losing teams are the ones that try to point out who's to blame.
Blaming President Trump for these floods is a depraved lie, and it serves no purpose during this time of national mourning.
I think that's what's been the most frustrating part about the politicization of this tragedy here, is that there's a lot of people commenting and chirping in on what should have happened.
No one is blaming Donald Trump for the floods. That's an absurd attempt at deflection. But they're trying to do this thing they have done with the epidemic of gun violence here in America, which is to shout, how dare you politicize this tragedy? And in some ways, floods do happen everywhere. This is different than guns. But also, policy is about risk and managing it and accountability, right? The government is there first and foremost to protect us. And Trump knows that, all the people on Fox News, because they've all made a cottage industry out of blaming Joe Biden and the Democrats for every natural disaster, from wildfires in Hawaii and California to the flooding in North Carolina in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. Remember that one? But more and more reporting is calling into question whether lives could have been saved from this flood. We know, for example, that federal forecasters, the National Weather Service, issued warnings to officials in the hardest hit county, that's Kerr County, 3 hours and 21 minutes before the first reports of flooding there. But according to some excellent reporting in the Texas Tribune, if any local officials got those warnings, and if so, whether they activated in any meaningful way in that 3 hours and 21 minutes remains a black box. By the time the city of Kerrville told residents on its Facebook page to evacuate after 7 a.m. Friday, many residents' escape routes were already flooded out. According to reporting by the New York Times, the National Weather Service employee whose job it was to make sure those warnings got traction, Paul Ura, the long-serving meteorologist in charge of warning coordination, had recently taken an unplanned early retirement amid cuts pushed by the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. He was not replaced. In other words, the National Weather Service had a forecast. They had a guy who used to do warning coordination with local officials. He was pushed out around Doge, and then the warning doesn't look like it got to local officials. So it sure looks like the key guy wasn't there because of Trump and Elon Musk's attacks on the government and federal workers. The AP reporting the Trump administration has cut hundreds of jobs at the National Weather Service, with staffing down by at least 20% and nearly half of its 122 field offices nationally, and at least a half dozen no longer staffed 24 hours a day. That was a policy change. That was something the government chose to do. And it wasn't chosen by our elected representatives in Congress, as the law requires, but by an absentee and addled president and the billionaire he deputized to take a chainsaw to the government before they had a big falling out. And it didn't happen in a vacuum. Since May, we have had an acting director for the Federal Emergency Management Agency who, quote, has no background in disaster response and told employees last month he did not realize the country had a hurricane season, according to the New York Times, which adds, it was not clear if he was joking. According to multiple outlets now, as of this morning, the acting FEMA director has still not made any plans to visit Texas, much less made any public statements on the floods that have killed over 100 people and left 179 more missing. This is all part of an ongoing systematic policy to attack core infrastructure of our government, particularly as it relates to emergencies and weather. This has shaped Donald Trump's entire political identity and the people he elevates to positions of power, like an anti-vaxxer who's the head of the Health and Human Services, or the head of the Environmental Protection Agency who's rapidly dismantling environmental protections. And it's not an accident. We have seen this before. The first time he was president, we watched Trump use a Sharpie to overrule his NOAA forecasters and literally redraw the predicted course of a hurricane. In fact, the acting NOAA administrator back then, who put out a statement supporting Trump and rebuking his own climate scientist, that guy, Neil Jacobs, is, you'll never guess, Trump's pick to be NOAA administrator in this administration. In fact, he had a Senate confirmation hearing today where he swore eventually he'd never do anything like that again.
You would do nothing differently?
I mean, there's probably some things I would do differently, and there's a lot of things that I did after that to, I guess, change any potential future outcome. One of them was revamp.
Let me ask this question, because I just had constituents die in New Mexico. We had constituents die in Texas. Would you sign off on an inaccurate statement due to political pressure in the same event, yes or no?
No.
I appreciate that very much.